Good morning. It's good to see everybody who's out and about this morning. It's good to see a little bit of the rain that we've had. It goes to replenish the earth and hopefully one day gets to water some crops that we like to eat so well. It is good to see everybody. And as we think about praying for each other, there are several of us who are not well, and we pray, continue to pray for them, and those who are made well, keep them in your prayers. As we think about today, this idea of testing Abraham, I'd like to ask the question, has your faith ever been tested? I mean, really put to the test, to some kind of strength test to find out exactly what you're made of. You know, comes a time in our lives when just through living and the circumstances that we're in, it may come to a point that we have to give everything that we have just to rely on God and His ability to see us through. You know, when we start thinking about that idea, that's giving everything God, this idea of being tested, I want us to think about, even a physical test. Maybe somebody in here has had a stress test at some point, just to find out if your heart can make it. Just what is going on with you. Or maybe there's some people that likes to compete as far as weightlifting goes. Maybe you've lifted weight. You say, just how much weight can I lift? How often can I do that? How far can I run? How far can I jump? And we put ourselves through these paces physically just to find out how we are doing, and so we want to do a little bit more. But the testing of our faith works very similarly. It's where it comes a point there in our lives that we say, I just have to rely that what God says is the way it ought to be. What God says is the way I ought to do things. Where God says I need to be, that's where I need to be. I don't need to be anywhere else. And the only person we can rely on to get us through this is God, His Word, and to put our trust in Him and our brothers and sisters to lead us through. And so when I start talking about this testing of faith and the testing of Abraham, that's really what we're looking at. This idea that at this time in Genesis chapter 22, Abraham's going to be asked to do something that he can only do through faith. He can only do it if he trusts God to get him through it. He can only do it if the God that tells him to do this is willing to keep His promises. And so when we look through here in Abraham's life in the book of Genesis, and we're going to see some things that I hope will help us in our own testing of faith. To kind of give a background, we need to start back in Genesis chapter 12. See, in Genesis chapter 12, God talks to Abram. Abram later becomes known as Abraham. But as we think about Abram and this discussion he has with the Lord, notice what he says. In Genesis chapter 12, starting in verse 1, he says, Get out of your country, from your family, and from your father's house, to a land that I will show you. I will make you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse him who curses you, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. Now, there's something as we look through this that we need to take note of. Abraham is literally supposed to leave everything he knows and go somewhere that he doesn't know where he's going to end up. Just whenever God tells him He's there, He's there. I mean, it'd be like tonight, this afternoon, as we leave services on the way home, there's a discussion like this. Okay, listen, I need you to pack your bags. We're leaving today. Where are we going? I don't know. Well, how do you know when we get there? God let me know. Are you sure we're taking this trip? Absolutely sure. We're leaving that in the morning. What would you think about that? Could you imagine Abraham all coming home and saying, it's time to go? Where are you going? I don't know. I'm going west. I mean, that's about all we can do, right? As far as how we travel. But if he does this, there's three blessings that's going to happen. I will make you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great, and you're going to be a blessing. And when we look at this in verse 4, it says, And so Abram departed as the Lord had spoken to him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he left Haran. Oh, something I forgot to tell you. He doesn't have any children. How is God going to raise up a nation from this man if he has no children? That's a good question. In fact, Abram means exalted father. He doesn't have any children. He's 75 years old. Now, he's going to live many more years. Don't get too excited. But he's lived this long and he has no children. And he leaves. I mean, that's the first kind of, okay, this is some faith. God talked to him, and he left with a promise that if he did, to be a great nation, and he has no children. Genesis chapter 15. When we come here to Genesis chapter 15, we start noticing that his descendants are going to be huge. We start reading it in verse 4. He says, "And behold, the word of the Lord came to him, saying, This one shall not be your heir." He thought that Eliezer of Damascus, someone born in his house, would be his heir. Not going to be his heir. But no, he goes on to say, "But one who will come from your own body shall be your heir." Then he brought him outside and said, "Look toward the heaven and count the stars, if you're able to number them." And he said to him, "So shall your descendants be." He goes on, starting in verse 12. What we find is an instance where, it's talked about in Hebrews 6. The instance here is where God is going to make an oath that he's going to raise up this great nation from his people. And he goes on, and from Abraham, and he goes on to talk about essentially the captivity in Egypt and other things. But he's saying it's going to happen. No, assuredly, certainly, this is going to happen. It's going to happen just like the way I said it would. If you look in Genesis chapter 17. In Genesis chapter 17, by the time we get here, Sarah has already thought she had a plan. If Sarah could not bear the children, she'll have Hagar bear Abraham a son, and therefore now that would be the heir. It's going to be an Ishmael. That's the resulting son. God says, no. He institutes, starting in verse 9, the circumcision. And what the circumcision does is ties the children of Abraham to the land of promise. That's what it is for. But then he goes on to say, in verse 19, "Then God said, No, Sarah, your wife, shall bear a son, and you shall call his name Isaac. I will establish my covenant with him for an everlasting covenant, and with his descendants after him." Now, Ishmael's not going to work. Sarah's still going to have a son. Sarah's son's going to be named Isaac. So he laughs. Genesis chapter 21. Notice what happens here. Starting in verse 1, we find out she's with child. In verse 3, Abraham called the name of his son who was born to him, whom Sarah bore to him, Isaac. Then Abraham circumcised his own son when he was 8 days old, as God had commanded. Now Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. And Sarah said, "God has made me laugh, and all who hear me will laugh." She said, "Who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? For I have borne him a son in his old age." 100 years old. Now, notice how this works. I mean, just take this background a little bit. Again, Abraham, who had no children, God promised, if you go to a place I will show you, you will have a great nation. I'll make you a mighty nation. And you'll make your name great. You're going to be a blessing to all the people. And all the nations of the earth shall be blessed through your seed. And yet, he has no children. But he left. He was 75. Isaac is born at 100. See, when we start looking at this, it's just a couple pages. That's 25 years that Abraham had to wait for Isaac to be born. Could you imagine having a promise? Saying this is going to happen. And it means the world to you because, he got up, he left, he went where God wanted him to go. And if we read Acts chapter 7, or when we do, we find out that he had stopped and Paneran and buried his father, and he got called again, and he ends up, but he left. He did what he was told to do. He's traveling around different places. He doesn't always get it right. He lies about Sarah being his wife twice. But he's following God, and he's holding on to this promise, but it's 25 years later before this child is born. Now, it's not his only child. He has Ishmael, but Ishmael isn't the one the promise is coming to. He has a one-of-a-kind son, Isaac, who has this promise that because Abraham left where he was living and went where God showed him, that he's going to raise up a nation through Isaac. So this is not just a son. This is a son he waited for promise for 25 years, and this son is going to bring all these offspring, as numerous as the stars in the skies, as numerous on the sand, on the sea. All these offspring, and it's all tied up into Isaac, and he had to hope and trust all the way for 25 years to get him. And then we read in Genesis chapter 22 that there's a test. There's a test. So you notice what it said, Genesis chapter 22, starting in verse 1. Now it came to pass after these things that God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham, and he said, here I am. Then he said, take now your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him as a burnt offering on one of the mountains which I shall tell you. Now notice what he said. So this one son, I want you to take over to these mountains of Moriah, and I want you to offer him as a burnt offering. Now we're like, I don't understand that. Burnt offering, we don't offer those. You don't come back from it. It burned up, like what we would consider cremation. If he takes Isaac there, Isaac, outside of a miracle, will not come back. And Abraham is asked to do this, to take this one son that he had waited so long for, a son that he loved, and offer it. It's a testing of faith. Something that he held dear, God asked and required of him. So what did he do? What did he do? Let's look at the example. In verse 3, so Abraham rose early in the morning and saddled his donkey and took 2 of his young men with him and Isaac his son, and he split the wood for the burnt offering and arose and went to the place which God had told him. Then on the 3rd day, Abraham lifted his eyes and saw the place afar off. They didn't go down the road. It's a 3 days journey. After Abraham decided we're doing this, they traveled 3 days to get there. But notice what he says. Then Abraham said to his young men, stay here with the donkey. The lad and I will go yonder and worship, and we will come back to you. Did you hear what he said? He said, we will come back. So let's put that in context. He said, you guys stay here. I'm taking Isaac, and Isaac and I are going to go over there, and we're going to worship, and we are going to come back. But a burnt offering you don't come back from. So how do we make sense of that? The Hebrews writer tells us. Look at Hebrews chapter 11. The Hebrews writer tells us what Abraham knew, what Abraham believed, what Abraham knew to be true. He says this in verse 17. By faith Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, and he who had received the promises offered up his only begotten son, of whom it was said, in Isaac your seed shall be called, concluding that God was able to raise him up even from the dead, from which he also received him in a figurative sense. Now we'll grab that in that figurative sense. We're going to get there. But Abraham was so sure that what God said would come to pass, he said, I'm going to go, and we're going to do this, and we're going to do this, and he's going to bring him back. He's going to bring him back. Because God promised that in Isaac my seed will be called. In Isaac this great nation is going to come. In Isaac all these descendants are going to be here. If I kill Isaac because God tells me to, he will bring him back. Now you want to talk about faith? That's faith. That is living by faith. There's a promise that God gave. He obeyed that promise 25 years and got his son. After a number of years, he knows he's still going to have him because God kept his promises then. God's going to keep his promises now, but we got to live this. And so he's there. Notice as we go further in verse 7, I could not imagine being Isaac. I mean, I really couldn't. Because at one point, he doesn't even know what's going on. He says this in verse 7, but Isaac spoke to Abraham his father and said, my father. And he said, here am I, my son. Then he said, look, the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering? See, Isaac knows something's going on. I mean, we have nothing to sacrifice. So what are we going to sacrifice? And Abraham said, my son, God will provide a lamb for himself. Provide for himself, rather, the lamb for a burnt offering. So the two of them went together. Then they came to the place of which God had told them. And Abraham built an altar there and placed the wood in order. And he bound Isaac his son and laid him on the altar upon the wood. Now this is where I'm like, it doesn't say anything about Isaac running away. He already knows there's a sacrifice going to happen. He already knows there's no lamb here. And now Dad's tying me up and put me on the wood. I have no idea what was going through Isaac's mind. But here we are. And Abraham, in verse 10, stretched his hand, took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven, and he said, Abraham, Abraham. So he said, here am I. Or here I am. And he said, do not lay your hand on the lad, or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. Then Abraham lifted his eyes and looked, and there behind him was a ram caught in a thicket by its horns. So Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up for a burnt offering instead of his son. And Abraham called the name of the place, the Lord will provide. As it is said to this day, in the mountain of the Lord it shall be provided. Could you imagine the relief Isaac had? Could you imagine the relief Abraham had? I have no doubt he believed exactly what would happen. The Hebrews writer tells us, he said God would provide. He goes all the way. I could not imagine the relief he felt. We don't talk about those things. But in his mind, you'd have to know he thought about this the whole way there. And then for God to provide this ram. Must have been some kind of relief. Must have been some kind of relief for him. He passed the test. You know, it wasn't until this point that the angel of the Lord told Abraham, now I know that you fear God. I mean, he did leave his father's house. I mean, he does take him so far until he dies. And you know, but he leaves where he is, a place that he knows. He's on his way, going to a place where he does not know where he's going. He only knows when he gets there, when God tells him he gets there. In fact, it's not until him and Lot separate that he finds out the place he's standing on is the promised land, so to speak, and that he's going to get. And so he doesn't know until then. And then this whole time, through all this stuff that happens to him, he's holding on to this one promise, and he was asked to give it up, and he can only do that by faith. Now, aren't you glad that they didn't ask him to do that back in Genesis chapter 12? I'm sure Abraham was glad he wasn't asked to do that back in Genesis chapter 12. Because it took him how long before God tested him in that way? Until he could pass that test. See, that's a long time, 25 years plus. And so it's an amazing thing to think. So we look at this test of Abraham. We see what happened. We know the story, the account, and we can read it, and we can put faith it happened that way. But how does that help me? Because God's not going to call me up and say, Ralph, offer your son up. And he's not going to do that. And I'm glad he's not going to do that. But how does it help me get from where I am now to where I need to be? I mean, because we do have promises, right? I mean, we're all living to go to a place that was promised to us, and that would be heaven if we obey the gospel, if we live according to his word. There is a promise that we're going to go to heaven and be where he is. How long have you been a Christian? See, some of that, for some of us in this room, it hasn't been very long, and so we can hold on to that because our faith, even though we've been tested and we've been tried a little bit, it's still pretty new. But if we're not careful, if we don't hold on to that, if we don't hold on that we can be the good in the world, that God is with us and sees us through all the ups and downs. When it gets 25, 30 years, we're sitting back saying, you know, God, I followed you a long time ago, but this is not what I signed up for. I mean, this is a whole different. I mean, this is hard. Are you ever going to come back? Are you ever going to take care of me? Am I ever going to see your goodness? So we may ask a question. And so what are some examples? What are some things that we can learn? Turn the Bibles to Romans in chapter 1. The most quoted, I would imagine, or most well-known, I would imagine, verse in chapter 1 probably is 16. Where it says, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God to salvation for everyone who believes, for the Jew first and also for the Greek." But all I want us to do is look at verse 17. "For in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith, as it is written, the just shall live by faith." Now I want us to think about that for a minute. The just shall live by faith. You know, have you ever thought about what it would have been like to be Peter? I mean, sometimes we talk like Peter, right? And what I mean by that is we're over here blessing God, and then over here we're like, God, I don't know. Let's just build 3 tabernacles, one for Jesus and one for Moses and one for Elijah. Let's just get them all. And that's when God says, "This is my beloved son, hear ye him." Could you imagine being reprimanded by God like that and your best friends hear it? I mean, that would be an amazing thing, wouldn't it? Let's build 3 tabernacles. No, listen to Jesus. Okay, now we're back over here. Jesus is God's son. You know, in the storm, when you start reading about that in John 6, and they're going across the the sea there, and Jesus is walking across the water, and the sea is boisterous. I mean, it's windy, and they're rowing and can't get nowhere. And they see Jesus, and they're all afraid, scared. I mean, we take a handful of men who makes their life on the water, and they're scared because they see something. They're scared. There's something going on. Think it's a ghost, but it's Jesus. Of the 12, one man. You know, we often criticize the one man, but he's the only one that says, Lord, if it is you, let me come to you. He's also the only one that got out of the boat. The only one. We give him a lot of discredit because when he gets to Jesus, what does he see? The wind and the waves. And here's a man who made his living on the water, and now he's walking on the water. And took his eyes off of Jesus and started to sink. You know, he's the only one that got out of the boat. It's important to notice that he's the only one that trusted God enough, Jesus enough, to get out of the boat and walk there. I wonder what that says about the other 11's faith. I mean, that's something to think about. But when we become a Christian and we put Christ on in baptism, it's almost as if, it ain't almost, it is, like we got out of a boat and we're walking a place and we have to look to Jesus to get where we're going. And there's all these things around us that try to shake our faith and get us disturbed and get us to quit paying attention on Jesus and start paying attention to something else. And it gets us all confused and we get all hateful and we forget who Jesus is and we start sinking. The only way we live is if we hold on to the faith. Hold on to those promises. If we follow Jesus, it's going to be okay. But we have to follow Jesus. We have to live by faith. Not in what we see, that's not faith. But to believe in Jesus. You ever thought about this? If we turn our Bibles to 2 Peter chapter 3 and verse 9. There were people who were making fun of the second coming. He's just not coming back. Now, could you imagine? If they did that well back, way back, within 50 years of his, leaving the earth and ascending to heaven, several years later, like he ain't coming back. Imagine what people think now, 2,000 years later. He ain't never coming back. They're making fun. They may even make fun of us because we believe he's coming back. But what does Peter remind them of? He reminds them of this in verse 9. The Lord is not slack concerning his promise, as some count slackness, but is long-suffering toward us, not willing that any should perish, but that all should come to repentance. So let's think about it this way. The Lord said he's coming back, but he's not slack. You say, what does that mean? He's not slack. This is what it means. You walk up to me and say, Ralph, I'm having a hard time. I need to get some snacks, some food. I need like a Coke and some peanuts. And it's like, $4. I said, okay. If you let me borrow the $4, I'll pay you back on payday. Okay. I give you the $4. Payday comes. Who am I looking for? You. Because you owe me $4. Oh, Ralph, I don't got $4 today. I know it's payday, but we have all these bills. Okay, I'll see you next payday. Oh, that would be great. Next payday comes out. Who am I looking for? I'm looking for you. You owe me $4. You said you would pay. Ralph, life is really hard. I don't have the $4 to give you. How long do you think it happens before you sit down and say, the guy's just not going to give us the $4? Shouldn't take very long. fact, I have a friend, after first payday, you better not ask him for a dime, he won't give it to you. You already owe me $4. I'm not giving you any more. Now, if you want to get it, I might give it to you, but I'm not loaning you nothing. Think about how that works. Jesus is going to come back. When's he going to come back? I don't know when he's going to come back. But Jesus said he was going to come back one day, and he's going to come back one day. When? As a thief in the night in verse 10. So what do we have to do? If the Lord is not slack concerning his promise, we've got to hold on to the promises. We've got to hold on to those things. What does that mean? If says he's going to come back, he's going to come back. Some of us will be alive. Some of us will be dead. All of us could be alive, or all of us could be dead. I don't know. But one day he's coming back, because he said so. But you know, there's other things that he promises. Once we obey the gospel, what does he promise? That we'll have forgiveness of sins. If I believe that when I obey the gospel, I should believe that there's forgiveness of sins. And so, a month later, when I find myself in a situation and I pray about it, I got to believe God forgive me over that. I have to believe God forgave me. So there's some things that has to happen. If God forgave me, first of all, I got to live like God forgave me. Second of all, I got to forgive myself. I got to live like I've been forgiven. I don't beat myself up. I live like I've been forgiven. See, there's lots of promises that God has given. And we got to trust in those promises. 1 Peter chapter 1 and verse 6. Peter tells these brethren that sometimes the Lord requires sacrifice. No. I don't mean a burnt offering. I mean, sometimes you're going to have to go through a really hard time. See, notice what he says in verse 6. In this you greatly rejoice, though now for a little while, if need be, you have been grieved by various trials, that the genuineness of your faith, being much more precious than gold that perishes, though it is tested by fire, may be found to praise, honor, and glory at the revelation of Jesus Christ, whom having not seen you love. Though now you do not see him, yet believing, you rejoice with joy inexpressible and full of glory, receiving the end of your faith, the salvation of your souls. Sometimes you're going to go through a really hard test. What is it? I don't know. Is it costly? Well, every test is costly. See, you look in Revelation chapter 2 and verse 10, and here's something that Jesus tells these brethren. And he tells them this. He tells them some really hard things are going to happen to them. And they're going to suffer. And they're going to be thrown into prison. Notice what he says. Do not fear any of those things which you're about to suffer. Indeed, the devil's about to throw some of you into prison that you may be tested. And you'll have tribulation 10 days. Be faithful unto death, and I will give you a crown of life. The 10 days could be a literal 10 days. It could be until all this tribulation, all this really hard time comes to an end. But he says, be faithful unto death, and literally it says, be faithful even if it kills you, and you will receive a crown of life. Even if it kills you, remain faithful. You know, that's a really hard thing to think about, isn't it? Sometimes we just give things up. Sometimes it's really hard and we got to say, I can't hold on to that anymore. I cannot hold on to that and try to live the way I need to live. I got to really put all my eggs, so to speak, in God's basket. There's no plan B. You ever sat and thought about that? Outside of the gospel, there's no plan B. That is it. And we've got to hold on to it all through this life. So there might be places we don't get to go. There might be things we don't get to do. There might be people who won't be our friends anymore. There might be family who won't talk to us. But if we're going to go be where Jesus is, then we have to do what he says. We have to be faithful all the way. All the way. It's not easy. I imagine when Abraham heard that, he probably said it wasn't easy. But what he dedicated himself to do. Today is heaven your home. Are you living like you want to be there? Are you giving your life for God? Are you living for him every day? Are you doing the best you can while you can? Or are you not? The only thing about that is you can answer. You're the only one that knows any of those questions. If you've not yet put Christ on a baptism, why not do it today? If you've done that and you've stopped living by faith, repent, pray, come home. If you have another need outside salvation, you can also let that need be expressed as you stand and sing this song of invitation.